Hello and welcome to another episode of D-Dubs Plays. Today we're going to be doing a tutorial on everything you need to know about rail. So let's start with the absolute basics. When you first open the Trains tab, you'll find that rail is locked. All you need to do to unlock that is place any train station, and as you can see, rail is now unlocked. You can draw rail on the surface, you can draw elevated rail, and you can draw underground rail. Now let's take a moment to talk about the role that rail plays in your city, the different types of rail that we have, and the problems that you might encounter. Now I like to think of transit in very similar terms to the way that I think of road hierarchy, and in that respect rail represents the highways of your transit system. So you want the rail to be the big fast transit method that connects your whole city. Just as you would not want your junctions too close together on your highways, you don't want your stations too close together on your railways, and just as you'd want your highways connected to arterial roads, you want your railways to connect to other methods of transit. Now unlike other transit methods, railways can carry cargo as well as passengers, so we have two types of railway, cargo rail and passenger rail, and then I would divide that further into subtypes, which would be intercity rail and local rail. Now the reason I divided the rail into these different types is because you have different levels of control over those different types of rail. Now for the purposes of example, I've created a very simple passenger local rail network with just two stations on it. And your local passenger rail works just like any of your other transit systems, where you place your stop in at one station, place it at the next station, and then make sure to complete the line. Now just like any of your other passenger networks, you can choose the number of vehicles on the line, you can select the type of train that you have with different capacities, and you decide which stations the trains stop at. And if you have the Train Stations Content Creator Pack, we also have some of these bypass train stations, which means that it's very easy to have trains that don't stop at a station bypass without being disrupted by the trains that are stopping. Now cargo stations work a little bit differently. You don't draw a line between cargo stations. Instead, cargo stations will automatically generate a train when they have enough cargo to fulfill a demand. Cargo stations should be placed near industry areas and commercial areas so that your cargo can be shipped from your industry to your commercial. And controlling the traffic on your internal cargo lines is just about managing the line well. Now I've created a very similar setup to the setup that I had for my passenger rail, and this is not ideal for cargo rail. The reason for that is if this station here were to send a train to the next station along the line, then that train would stop there and start unloading. If another train comes along behind it, that train then has to wait until this train is unloaded before it can pass by. Now a simple solution to that problem is to always have a bypass line next to your stations. Now it's important to make sure that the bypass line is shorter than the line that the station is on. Your trains will always try to take the shorter route, so if the station is on the shorter route, then the bypass line will just not get used. It's also really important to leave at least a train's length either side of the station. The reason for that is so that if a train has to wait for a train that's already at the station, it isn't blocking the junction here. And this is true of any junction that you create with rail. Say you were to create a three-way junction like this for example, but those lengths were not long enough to accommodate a full train, then what you might have is a train stops on this line to let a train past, and the back of it blocks this junction here. So a train that wants to come along here is now stopped by the back of that train, but the back of it is sticking out past this junction, and now the train on this line can't get past, and the back of it is blocking the first train. And now none of those trains are going to move until one of them despawns. So whenever you're building rail junctions, make sure they're large. A full train length is the minimum that you should have. I would recommend going for at least 2 train lengths just to be on the safe side. Anyway, back to our cargo stations on our internal rail network. Now because we have so much less control over the number of trains that are on the cargo lines, I would strongly recommend that you keep your cargo lines separate from your passenger line. And so far I've been talking about internal rail networks. I would also recommend keeping the intercity lines separate from the local lines. Your intercity lines are the lines that you have the least amount of control over, because not only do they spawn trains from your external connections when you need to import goods, but they'll also spawn trains that will go from the external connection on one side straight through to the external connection on the other side. Trains that will never stop in your city but will cause traffic on the line. Now when you have a line that has an external connection in two places, it's really easy to separate your external cargo and passenger rail while simultaneously preventing trains from spawning that are just going to go straight through the city without stopping. All you need to do is break this line, and then you can use this one to connect to an external cargo station and this one to connect to an external passenger station. So here's a little example of how that might work. We've got a cargo station connected to the intercity line here. The only trains that will spawn on this line will be the intercity cargo trains. The line only has one external connection because we've broken it, so no passenger trains will spawn to pass straight through. Neither will any cargo trains. Only trains that are stopping at this station will spawn at the external connection. And then we've connected this to another station with a little loop of road, so any goods for import or export will be transferred between the stations via this little loop of road, and our internal cargo rail network will remain separate from the intercity network. Now if you happen to have the airport's DLC, you can use this station instead of two separate stations. This station has two lines running through it, so you could have one line as your external cargo line and the other line as your internal cargo line. So that makes life a little bit easier with keeping your external and internal lines separated. And similarly, if you've got the train stations content creator pack, there are train stations that you can use to do something similar. I've used this as an example of how you can separate your passenger, internal and external rail networks. If you don't have that CCP, then you would need to do something similar to what I've done with the cargo stations here, but with passenger rail instead. Now I mentioned how it's really important to make sure that you've got good connectivity to other methods of transport next to your rail stations, and a transport hub is a good way of making sure you do that. Back in March, most of us got access to a range of new hubs, including this one, which has got access to almost every form of transit in the game. Unfortunately, those on Remastered still don't have access to these, but they will be coming in the summer. But it is easy enough to create your own transit hubs, and I've created an example here that illustrates all of the principles that I would use. So I've made sure that all of the stops are off of the arterial road. I've just put bus stops and metro just outside of the train station, and I've also made sure to include some pedestrian infrastructure. You want your Sims to have lots of different options of how they can complete their journeys once they get off the train, just to prevent them all from pulling out their pocket cars and flooding your roads with traffic outside every train station. So I thought to finish up, I'd bring you over to my Let's Play City Sandy Shores to show you how I've implemented some of these principles in this city. As you can see, I have two parallel lines. One is for cargo and the other is for passenger, so I keep my internal and external passenger and cargo lines separate. On this map I had two separate external lines which only have one external connection. So on this one I made it the cargo line, and I used the dual line station from the airport's DLC as the transfer hub. On the other line I used this station to transfer between external and internal passenger lines. You can see here I've used a bypass line next to the cargo station at the ore industry area, so that any trains that are not stopping at this station can pass by unimpeded. And then from this train station, for example, we have bus stops and cycle paths just up the road here, and we also have a metro station just down the road here, so it's very easy for my passengers to transfer from one transit type to another. Now this city is still a work in progress, and so these lines are currently incomplete, but eventually they are going to loop the entire city, and they will essentially be the highways of my transit system. People will be able to go from one side of the city to the other on the rail, and then they'll be able to go anywhere within the city using the metro, tram system or bus routes. I try to make sure my industry areas are not too big, so none of the stations should get overloaded with too much cargo. I have a cargo airport as well as the external connection, and eventually there will be a cargo harbour as well, so lots of places for the cargo to be transferred for export. And I'll also have cargo stations next to my large commercial areas as well. Now I currently only have a population of just under 30,000, so you can see I don't have an awful lot of rail traffic at the moment. But even once this city's finished, I shouldn't have too many issues with rail traffic, just because I've kept all of those lines separate and I've given myself as much control as possible over what traffic is on the line at any given time. So hopefully that's given you some ideas about how you can better design your rail networks and keep that rail traffic under control. Next week I'll be back here in Sandy Shores with another Let's Play episode. The following week there will be another tutorial which will be on the basics of road design. Now I will cover a little bit about road hierarchy, but I'll also be talking about how to use the various tools in the game to make sure you've got nice smooth roads, pretty curves, gentle gradients on your slopes, things like that that I think a lot of beginners find tricky. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful and I will catch you in the next one.